Hello, and welcome to students at the Warriner School in Bloxham. I'm S Davies, and you might know me as your school's volunteer resident author. I also worked for a while there as a teaching assistant, and I ran the lunchtime creative writing club in the library. I'm really sorry I can't come in and meet you in person at the moment. So instead, I'm recording this in my little back bedroom, which is my study. This is where my stories and books get written. And the most important part is that I've got a lovely view out of my window. A park and fields, a valley with hills in the distance. This is important because of the time I spend gazing out of the window. Thinking. Most story writing is not actually typing, getting the words down, but dreaming, wondering, creating, visualizing, working out what happens next, getting to know my characters. In other words, thinking. Each day I also go for a walk out the back in order to think. It's nearly 15 years ago now that I had the initial idea for my first book, and I've been a full-time author since 2012. In that time I've had 3 books published, and they're fantasy adventure novels for young people. This banner is the cover for my first book, Destiny's Rebel, and they're a trilogy, a series of 3, with Destiny's Revenge and Destiny's Ruin. So what are they about? They're the story of Catelyn, a 17-year-old girl who just happens to have been born a princess. At the start, she's days away from coming of age and inheriting her kingdom, and she's dreading it, because becoming queen will bring responsibility and expectations and conflict. She's always been the sort to assert her freedom, so she decides to run away for one last time to rebel against her destiny. But she's captured and discovers a threat to her kingdom, and it becomes a race against time for her to get back for her coronation and to save her people. But does she even want to do that? Because that will mean accepting her fate as queen. In many ways, Cat's story is my story, because although I'm not a teenage princess, she wrestles with the same things I've wrestled with, namely what we can and can't choose about our lives. For example, we can't choose when or where we're born, who our parents are, who else is in our family, or what sort of upbringing we get. What we can choose, once we're old enough to decide for ourselves, is what we do with the start in life we've been given. So, Catelyn objects that she didn't ask to be born a princess, and what if she wants to do something else with her life? Where is her free will or choice in that? Or can she carve out her own destiny? I won't give away what happens, but there are themes of needing to be true to who we are, to face up to responsibilities rather than run away from them, and that we might not need to face them alone. The books are set in an imaginary medieval world because I love castles and kingdoms, swords and sailing ships. They're fast-paced adventure stories full of twists and turns, but although they're fantasy, I chose not to include dragons or goblins or wizards in these. It's a human, political story about the fate of a girl and her kingdom, and the fantasy comes from a mythology of gods, both good and evil, and their powers in the world through their followers and in a sacred relic. There's a separate story in each of the 3 books, but they follow each other in time, so I strongly recommend reading them in this order: Destiny's Rebel first, and then Revenge, and then Ruin, because otherwise the later books give away what happens in the earlier ones. I'm going to give you a taste now by reading you the end of the first chapter. This is an action scene, so I hope that's all right with all of you. Sit back and relax for about 5 minutes. 17-year-old Cat, remember, has rebelled against her destiny to be queen and decided to run away. She's escaped from the castle down to the harbour and boarded a sailing ship, a galleon called the Oyster Shell. under Captain Farag and First Mate Jersel. They're on the deck and sailing out of the bay. "Look! Hermit's Isle! Look!" Cat jumped at the terrified shout from above. Craning her neck, she squinted upwards. The lookout in the crow's nest was flinging his arms to the west. Jersel yelled for the captain. Cat turned and saw the reason for his cry. The blood drained from her cheeks as she stared. Farag dashed from his cabin. "What is it?" he shouted up. "What do you see?" "Slavers!" the lookout screamed. "Slave traders!" Pandemonium broke out around her. The captain and Jersel drew weapons and shouted orders. The crew were running and yelling. Some leapt to the rail to look. Some ran to arm themselves. A few hurried to hide. The oyster shell's crew began to form a grim-faced line at the rail, clutching clubs and knives. From behind the wooded isle, a small black ship was springing its ambush, and the galleon was too slow to outrun it. "Come on, Cat, move!" She sprinted to her cabin, threw off the cloak and grabbed her quiver and shortbow. She chose the height of the forecastle deck and scurried up the ladder. She'd just said to Jersel about doing her share when fighting started, but hadn't expected to prove it so soon. She slung on the quiver and readied her bow. Cat looked out and was transfixed. A black flag with crossed swords fluttered above bulging sails as the small black ship raced closer. Figures teemed on the slaver deck like ants with their nest disturbed. The slavers jeered and brandished their weapons. Cat waited in impatient dread, wishing her arrows were of better use against moving targets at a distance. Her stomach knotted, and she gripped her bow to stop her arms from shaking. Did slavers slaughter? She thought in sudden panic, or did they only kidnap? She wiped the sweat from her hands on her trousers. She had to get herself together. Concentrate. Breathe. Cat fired twice above the heads of the crew as the enemy ship approached, but couldn't see if she hit any target. The two hulls collided with a splintering crunch, and Cat staggered as the oyster shell lurched. The slavers threw grappling hooks to secure the ships and swarmed across. A dozen enemies reached the rail. Cries and curses filled the air with the clash of metal, wood and bone. Cat willed the crew to lunge and push, but more slavers were climbing towards them. The invaders gained the deck. Jersel's scimitar fell too, Farag's sword another, and a vicious melee broke out. The crew were falling or being wrestled overboard by stronger arms. Cat fired her first clear shot, and an enemy crumpled with an arrow in his chest. She felled another, and then remembered the command of her arms master. Find the leader, get the chief. And now she saw him. A swarthy brute stood at the rail, his long hair and black cape billowing. He was directing the slaughter with the point of his cutlass, and shrieking his commands with oaths and swearing. With her first enemies dead, a cold focus descended on Cat. Her arrow thudded into the slaver chief's shoulder, and he roared in pain. While Cat strung her next missile, he screamed at his minions to get her. She aimed at his head, and was startled by an unearthly sight, a flicker of crimson light in his eyes. She'd no time to worry about that. By instinct, the slaver chief ducked. Cat was quicker, and her arrow pierced his neck. That should have killed him. But the crimson light. To avoid Cat's aim, the injured chief dodged and weaved, but Jersel's scimitar came from behind and felled him to the deck. Before Cat could shoot again, 3 slavers swept aside 2 of the crew and reached the forecastle ladder. This shot had to count. Her arrow sped into an upturned face, and one fell from the ladder, screaming. With no time to reload, Kat dropped her bow and grabbed the wooden rails. She swung herself up and landed her boots on the skull of the nearest foe. He fell back too, but the third caught her ankle and stabbed a knife in her leg. Agony shot up Kat's body and forced itself out in a scream. She fumbled to whip out the dagger at her belt, but scrabbled to hold on as the slaver heaved her forwards. Her sweaty hands slipped on the wood. She flew from the ladder, and her head bounced hard off the deck. Fog closed in, with dizzying lights. Her limbs were too heavy. Why couldn't she get up? No, she mustn't rest, or drift away. Rough arms grabbed her, but her body wouldn't respond. Lifted up, and then she was falling. End of chapter 1. If you want to know how it turns out and what happens to Kat, then obviously you'll need to read the books. There might be copies in the school library if they haven't all been borrowed. Apart from that, the best place to get them is Amazon. The Kindle ebooks are a couple of pounds each, with the paperbacks more. As a special offer for you, and with Christmas coming up, hint hint, if any of you would like a signed paperback or the whole trilogy from me with your name in them, I can do that for £7 for each book. If you want to, put the cash in an envelope with your name on it and what you'd like, and give that to the school librarian, Mrs. Morton. She'll get that to me and I'll deliver the signed books to her. I think we have a live virtual question and answer session coming up, and I'm really looking forward to that. And we hope that before long I'll be able to come into school again and resume the Creative Writing Club. So bye for now, and thanks for listening.